Coronavirus, or COVID-19, is ultimately all about one thing, and that is the destruction of national sovereignty and really maintaining the status quo of the establishment elitist globalist system that is ruling the world right now. Let's not forget, everyone, that, when Donald Trump took office, he took office with the goal of conveying this message to the American people, the message of, be proud of who you are, be proud of being an American. And it wasn't just Donald Trump that was trying to inculcate this specific message. It was people like Boris Johnson, Viktor Orban, Narendra Modi in India. It wasn't just in, North American and Western countries. It was also in Eastern countries, Asian countries, Shinzo Abe in Japan. This entire aggregate of nationalist consciousness was all about trying to convey a message to the whole world. And that really was be proud of who you are. Ultimately, that's what this was about. So what happened? Now, Donald Trump takes office, and the deep state is absolutely enraged by this. The elitists get together, and they were led by Bill Gates. Bill Gates convenes this whole meeting, and you had nationalist movements going on at this time, and that was just enraging the elites. They had to do this meeting, and so there was this whole conspiracy between people like Bill Gates and globalist entities like the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and the European Union. And they wanted to take down Trump, but they couldn't because the international popularity for nationalism against the status quo internationalism is so deep that they had to come up with some sort of a weapon to squash the entire nationalist consciousness, and that was coronavirus, COVID-19. That's what this whole thing was about, and that's the reason why. It's all about destroying nationalism, but at the same time, the biggest geopolitical effect of coronavirus that we are currently seeing is actually de-globalization, not globalization, de-globalization. And the path that the corona crisis has carved is a path that is leading us towards a global phenomena of nationalism. And we've been seeing this phenomena for the last few years now, and coronavirus, well, really the corona crisis, is only intensifying this phenomena. There was a very interesting article that was published by The Guardian recently, and the article is talking about how the corona crisis is leading us towards populism and nationalism and de-globalization, basically nationalism and populism. And I want to read to you guys an excerpt that is really, really eye-opening and gets to the heart of what we have been talking about at Shoebot.com for years now. And it says here, quote, "With millions of people losing their jobs or working and earning less, the income and wealth gaps of the 21st century economy will widen further. To guard against future supply chain shocks, companies in advanced economies will reshore production from low-cost regions to high-cost domestic markets." So in other words, hey, the whole coronavirus situation, it just shows why we don't need globalization. Globalization didn't help us in this entire crisis. We've lost tens of thousands of people. And China made this whole thing worse. It's China's fault. And then you're going to have the Italians saying, hey, the EU didn't help us. Globalization hasn't helped us. We simply just need to look after ourselves. And this is going to be an argument that is going to echo, it is going to resound throughout the world. And we see this in countries like Japan, where the government is incentivizing Japanese companies to no longer do production in China and to bring production back to Japan, where Japanese workers can work in the production of whatever products they're making. Now look at what it says here. But rather than helping workers at home, because this is not going to help local workers, it's not going to help native workers ultimately. Why? The article explains. This trend will accelerate the pace of automation, using machines to do the work, putting downward pressure on wages and further fanning the flames of populism, nationalism, and xenophobia. So in other words, the companies are going to say, okay, you don't want us to use foreign labor anymore. You want us to use American labor. You want us to use you want us to bring production back to the home country ultimately. So these companies are going to bring production back to the motherland, and the American worker or the Western worker is going to demand more wages because the foreign labor is cheaper. That's why companies hire foreigners. That's why companies hire migrants. That's why they hire illegal immigrants, because it's cheaper. And the product ultimately is cheaper when you have foreign labor doing the work. That's why shoes, for example, are affordable. If you have Nikes being made by purely American hands, then the shoes are going to be more expensive. And so the companies are going to think, well, I don't really want to pay an American worker all of this money. I can just use machines to do the work. So you are going to see an increase in automation, an increase of the use of machines to do work. That's why there has been so much talk in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years or so about artificial intelligence, the military using tanks that don't need a human to drive it, or they're talking about using a fighter jet that doesn't need a human pilot, talking about machines that can do certain manual labor. That's why there has been so much talk about this, because companies can foresee, not entirely, but they can more or less foresee what is to come, and they have been anticipating for it. So the article goes on to say that one of the next trends that we are going to be seeing a lot of is deglobalization, or really the opposite of globalization, a more intense fixation on things like nationalization. So it says here that the pandemic is accelerating trends towards balkanization and fragmentation that were already well underway. Yes, and this is really attested by Brexit, because Brexit really was the fragmentation of the European Union. The US and China will decouple faster, and most countries will respond by adopting still more protectionist policies, nationalism, to shield domestic firms and workers from global disruptions. The post-pandemic world will be marked by tighter restrictions on the movement of goods, services, capital, labor, technology, data, and information. This is already happening in the pharmaceutical and medical equipment and food sectors, where governments are imposing export restrictions and other protectionist measures in response to the crisis. The backlash against democracy will reinforce this trend. Populist leaders, fascist or far-left socialists, often benefit from economic weakness, mass unemployment, and rising inequality. Under conditions of heightened economic insecurity, there will be a strong impulse to scapegoat foreigners for the crisis. And we have already been seeing a glimpse of this in the United States, where you have been hearing stories about how an American man or a white American man sees an Asian, and it doesn't matter if the Asian was born in the US. This white person will say, you Asians are spreading coronavirus. And the guy's like, hey, what are you talking about? I was born in California. I served in the military. Oh, it doesn't matter. All you Asians are the same. You're spreading disease. We saw this in Italy, in which a gang of teenagers attacked a young Chinese boy and took him to the ground and beat him over and over again with their feet so horrendously that the boy needed multiple stitches to his face. The boy was rescued by a 40-year-old Moroccan man. 40-year-old Moroccan man rescues a Chinese boy from a bunch of teenagers who come from a traditionally Catholic background. Just look at the irony of that story. Who is your brother? Is it the rabbi who walks past you, or is it the Samaritan who you view as a heretic? You see the parables of Christ manifesting in the physical world. You just have to look closely. So it goes on to say blue collar workers and broad cohorts of the middle class will become more susceptible to populist rhetoric, particularly proposals to restrict migration and trade. And we are already seeing this with the Trump administration banning immigration and migration into the United States. And they are doing so under the pretext of coronavirus, which is very interesting because, well, the conservatives are always the ones talking about how coronavirus is not a big deal, that it's overblown. But yet they'll say because of coronavirus, we have to ban immigration. Wait a second. It's not a big deal. So why should you ban immigration? Oh, you're using it to your advantage. Oh, you are doing a Machiavellian strategy and taking advantage of a crisis to advance your own agenda. So all of these people have been saying that coronavirus is a strategy or it's a conspiracy of the globalists, yet we are actually seeing the opposite of what you guys have been saying. We're seeing deglobalization. So maybe the elites and the powers that be, maybe what they really want is what you guys want. A lot of times when people point their fingers at a government and say, "Oh, look at this government; it's so evil," or they say, "Oh, look, the globalists," or look at this, international status quo that's ruling the world; it's so evil. Most of the time, actually, I want to say all the time, those people are evil and they actually have their own insidious agendas. We've seen this throughout history, where a group of rebels or some armchair intellectual revolutionaries say, oh, the king is a tyrant, yada, yada, yada. And then they do a revolution. And then when the rebels take power, they're actually horrendous. And they make the king that they hated so much look like a very, very gentle leader. We are seeing a very scary trend towards a vicious nationalism. And the thing is that we really haven't, I don't want to say we haven't learned from history, because a lot of people learn history, but they'll repeat the same mistakes. What we haven't learned is how, for one thing, history rhymes, and how evil and deceptive people hide their motivations under the cover of the current day crisis. Anytime you have a crisis, you're going to have opposition to the narrative. So the narrative in this case is that coronavirus is very destructive and very deadly. That is the narrative. That's the official narrative coming from the official medical establishment. What do you have? You have an opposition. And when you look into that opposition, you will always find very, very questionable people. Very, very questionable people. And so the people who are saying coronavirus is overblown, these are actually the very people who are pushing for nationalism. Donald Trump said coronavirus is overblown, yet he's using the situation as a way to advance his own anti-immigration policies. So the opposition in this case, they are the ones saying it's overblown, it's not a big deal, it's all plan of the globalists. And by doing that, they're actually advancing the whole ideology of nationalism. So really, if you look at the whole thing in perspective, if you look at the whole broader picture of this entire situation, it's very interesting that these people are arguing, well, it's all about globalization, but yet the actual effects are bringing us towards what they want, what the opposition wants, what the right wing wants, and that is nationalism. So be prepared to see nationalism getting more and more popular. And also, there is another thing that I wanted to read to you. This is also very interesting. This is one thing that the article pointed to. And it's talking about how the national security industrial complex is going to grow. And it says here that the U.S. private tech sector will become increasingly integrated into the national security industrial complex. So not only expect a boom in nationalism and populism, but also expect a boom in militarism, not just in the United States, but in Europe as well. Even before, years before this whole coronavirus thing exploded, I was talking about German militarism and how it is rising. And so, with the decline of globalization, you are going to have the increase or a surge in nationalism. And so, people are going to be talking about what? We have to defend ourselves. We cannot rely on other countries. That's why you heard Merkel just a couple of years ago saying, I can no longer trust the United States. Deutschland can no longer trust her allies. We have to rely on ourselves. And she also said we have to lead Europe. Like, Europe has to follow its own destiny. And what she means by that is Germany leading Europe, the rest of Europe. So, yeah, that's really the bottom line. You are seeing, it's a very exciting time to be alive, but it's also very scary. You are seeing the next world war developing. That's what you are seeing. It's very surreal. Anyway, hope you guys have learned something from this message. Hope you guys have enjoyed this message. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.